Hi there, in this quick tutorial I'm just going to go through a few of the techniques I used to create this animation. So really it was just about how I modelled this thermionic valve and how to set up some of the materials. I may go through some of the camera animation as well, though that's also pretty straightforward. So this is really just a very basic tutorial on how to model something like this. So you can see we've got some glowing heaters in the middle there, and we've got a decal as the label on the glass. We've got some silvered glass towards the top, which you'll see at the end better. And I've added a little bit of volumetrics in there as well, as some stars in the background. And there you can see the silvering on the top there, which I'll also show how to create. So to begin with, one of the interesting things to create is that little heater in the middle. Thermionic valves, of course, by their name, need heat to work. So I tried a number of different ways to do it, but the simplest was pretty much to just draw that little heater and then duplicate it. So I'm just going to add a simple mesh cylinder to start with, and there it is. And I'm going to go into edit mode, face select mode, and I'm just going to remove those two faces. So we've just got a little segment of cylinder, and I'll set that to shade smooth. Now, because it's difficult to see in orthographic mode, which is what I'm in, when we're looking from above, as you can see there, other than when we've got it selected, in edit mode, I'm going to make sure everything is selected, then press E, S for scale, and then Shift Z. And we'll just scale it in slightly so that we've got some thickness. Now we can see our cylinder. Still in edit mode with everything selected, Shift D and GX, and just some arbitrary amount. I'm just going to push another version of the cylinder off to the right there. Those will form our two spindles around which the heaters are wound. Now I'm going to add a curve, which will be a simple path curve. I'll put that here, and we'll just select some of the points. To begin with, I'm just going to put very basic points like this. The curve obviously is not matching the cylinders yet, so I'm just going to drag that point off over here, and then E to add more points on the curve, and I'll add another one there as well, and then E and bring this one over to here. So obviously it doesn't match the curves at all. We'll fix that now. So I'm going to select those three, right click and say subdivide to add some more points, and then I'll do the same over here, and then we'll just start reshaping the curve to more closely match the curvature of the cylinder. And I'm going to go slightly outside the cylinder because at the moment this is just an unrenderable object, this curve. So I'm going to scale up slightly for the whole thing now. And you should be able to see my mouse presses and so on over here. So just really trying to match the shape of the curve. I did try spirals and things like that, but I wasn't satisfied with the result. I ended up just basically modeling this. It's quite a complex shape with curves going in multiple directions. It's only going to be seen from some distance though, so it doesn't matter too much. And where you want to, you can add additional points like that. So at the moment it's on a flat plane. What we actually want to do, of course, is just using Ctrl+ there, raise part of it up because it's going to be climbing up the cylinders as it goes. So out of edit mode for a moment, I'm just going to lower the curve to the bottom of the cylinder, then back in edit mode with just these selected, and maybe that one as well. I'm going to raise it up to about the top of the cylinder. It's just GZ. Now, although the shape I've created is very angular, when I come out of edit mode you can see it puts a Bezier curve on it, and it's a lot nicer. So with curve selected, out of edit mode, come into the curve properties, we'll come down to geometry here and bevel. That may not be open by default. And if we just turn that up slightly, you can see we get a little tube forming, perhaps a little thicker than that. And before I go any further, I'm now going to go over to here and add a modifier, which is an array modifier. Turn off the factor for X and add a factor for Z. So 1 is not far off, but it's obviously not quite right. But what we can do now is actually adjust the alignment. So what I want to do is just tweak that Z value so those are pretty closely aligned with this. We can make some small adjustments, but they need to be quite close. So we'll go to 0.99, 0.95, 0.93 is pretty close. And I'm just going to select that point GX and just bring those 2 points together. So You can now see we've joined the little heater wire together, and we can now just add as many of those as we want. I did mine completely straight the first time, but I quite like this sort of curved step. So I could add, say, 25 of those, and off they go. If I come down to here, I could just join this cylinder with the heater wire, but there's a lot of advantages in not completely joining everything together and not turning everything into a simple mesh, because you can play around with it. If you want that heater to have perhaps some more steps in it, then it's easy enough to just go back in and add some more into the array. What I will do though is I will select the heater, then select this little cylinder down here and Control P and say set parent to object keep transform. So that means if I move these cylinders around, the heater wire will move with it. I think we'll make the heater slightly thicker. I'll come down to the curve properties and the bevel again, and we'll just go slightly thicker again. Now it looks like we need to adjust our array again because we've effectively made it taller. That's because we're using relative offset. You can use a constant offset. So if I take relative offset off and that constant offset, and we put 1 on the Z just as a starting point, and there you can see we've now got precise alignment, just getting there, close enough that you can't see it. And if we go back to here and adjust the bevel, you can see that no longer offsets, it holds its position. So that's a better thing to do, use constant offset, not relative offset. We'll now add an array to our cylinders. We could just put a simple mesh cylinder up there, but for the same reasons, it allows us to do parametric changes. For this one we will use relative because it's a very simple shape. However, before I do that, I've got some additional faces in here that I don't need just because of the way that I created the thickness. I could just remove the inner part of this cylinder because it's not strictly needed. In fact, that's what I will do. So I'm just going to select, I only created those inner parts so that I could see them from above. So I'll select that. So I selected all the inner faces there, Control plus, and then X and remove faces. So now we won't get any artifacts when we extend that up. So if we put that up by 25, that gives us a nice little heater, and we can move that around. And if I wanted 2 of them, which I did, and I wanted them side by side, add another modifier and add another array, and we'll set that to constant offset, and we just need to set it to whatever size we want. So in this case it's 25 meters, it just happens to be the scale I'm working at, and do the same for the heater wire. Add an array, constant offset at 25 meters and no X. 25 meters on the X. Doesn't seem to quite perfectly align, so we'll just adjust that slightly. And there we go. So we can now just select the cylinders here, move that around, and we've got 2 nice heaters. And if we want them taller, just select the heater wire and we can just go up like that. And obviously do the same with the other. Now we could at this point, if we wanted to turn the wire into a mesh, you can just right click the wire and say convert to mesh, and you could then join it to the cylinder, and then you'd only need to adjust one object array modifier in order to make it taller or shorter. But it would mean you wouldn't be able to easily adjust the thickness of the wire and things like that. So as far as possible, try and stick with arrays. It adds a little bit of complication in some ways, but it also means that you've got flexibility if you want to change it later. So at this point, let's look at materials. And I should say I did all of this in Eevee so that it could be rendered fairly quickly. So we'll switch to Eevee now as we're going to do some materials. So we'll go to materials and we'll say new. I've opened a little window at the top there, and we'll set that to a shader editor. So make sure you've got your heater wire selected, say new, and we'll call that heater glow. Set the base material to just a sort of medium to dark grey. Everything else stayed at default until we come down to emission, when I set that to a reasonably strong orangey sort of colour. You could use black body effects in order to effectively be able to change the temperature of the wire, and that would make it set a colour that related to the temperature, as you can do with flame effects, but that's a bit more advanced than we need to get into for this tutorial. So just a nice bright orange colour, and then I set the emission strength to 8. So that's emission colour of orange and an emission strength of 8. At this point I'm just going to go into the settings for Eevee, and we'll turn on screen space reflections. And you may have noticed our cylinders started to reflect the light of the heater just as soon as we did that. So without that on, they're just black and it doesn't look quite right. In Cycles, that would have already been doing that, but for Eevee, you do need to tell it that you want screen space reflections. And while we're in here, I'm going to turn refraction on as well, because when we add the glass, we might get some effects from that and we might want them. So that's our heaters, and we just need to add a material for our cylinders. So I just made these a basic metallic sort of color. We'll call this steel, accepting the defaults from the principled shader that will be added. Turn metallic all the way up. You can see that's much more reflective now. And then decide how matte you want the surface. By default, it's at 50%. I set it down from that a little bit, so slightly more reflective. You can have a mirror effect, of course, but it will be a mirror rather than showing more diffuse light, and therefore won't illuminate the scene as well. But it's up to you. Everything else left at default. If I turn the highlighting from the overlay off, we can see what we're getting a bit better. If I turn viewport sampling up a little bit, we get a slightly smoother scene. So next we just need some of the little plates that go in the middle. I believe they're made of mica, kind of ceramic. So we'll just create a mesh circle. Let's turn our overlays on to be able to see it. Scale that up a bit. And it needs to enclose our heaters. So I'm just going to select those heaters and a circle. And just put those in the middle there so that everything's aligned. So bring that in slightly. And then we just need to create some shapes. So at this point what I did was actually delete an awful lot of this circle. So all bar 1/4 of it is deleted. X vertices. I'm going to come up here and I'm going to set this setting to 3D cursor. So that means when I scale things, they'll be scaled relative to the 3D cursor. I'm going to take those 3 points and say scale, and we'll just bring them in there. So I'm now going to select that, E, and then scale in. And then if you've got loop tools enabled, which is just an add-on that helps with modeling and things like that, if you come up to here and go up to edit, preferences, make sure you've got add-ons selected, and make sure mesh loop tools is enabled. And this will just give you a few extra things, such as when you are in edit mode, we can do Control R and we can add another loop of vertices like that, and then slide it to where we want it. And I'm doing it again here. Unless you're trying to model a real device that you're copying, then this is really just down to artistic choice, I would say. Add another loop just there, another one there, and another one there. And the reason I'm adding these loops is because I want to be able to move things around a bit. So I said G, Shift, Z there, which allowed me to slide that point around without coming up or down on the Z axis. And you can also do it by pressing GG, and that will basically slide it around within that plane. So I'm just trying to conform to the shape of my heater coil there with a slight gap. I want it to be a visible gap. I'm going to select those 2 vertices, press X and delete them. I'm going to Control 2 and add a subdivision surface, and you can see it's gone all smooth. So what that's done is added this modifier here automatically for us. Control 2, put it on there at 2 levels. If I turn it down a level, you can see it's slightly less smoothed, so that's fine. And now I want to add another modifier, which is a mirror modifier. And you can see that's put a copy of it over there by default on the X axis, so it's mirroring from one side to the other. And I want to mirror on the Y axis as well, so I'll press that, and you can see we've got that there. Now we want them to actually join, so if we grab here by pressing the left mouse button and drag this down, you can see they suddenly join together. We've now got a little plate which goes around our object. I think I'll draw these out slightly, so I'm just scaling out, and that gives us a rounder shape. Perhaps scale that one in, and then if we want to, we could put some more holes in it. So I'm going to go back up here and say median point and just say scale on that. Then I'm going to select all the points around there, press I, and that's called inset, and that gives me a set of vertices inside. And now I can press X and delete faces, so that creates us a little hole in there. And if I want to, I can make that a little bigger, perhaps extend those points like that, just to create some interesting patterning and so on. I could use an array modifier here, but I want to do something slightly different with one of the shapes. So all I'm going to do is Shift D and then GZ. If you want to be able to make modifications in one of these and have it reflected into the other, you can do Alt D. So I'll show you what I mean by that. If I do Alt D, GZ, and then select one of them, it doesn't really matter which one. You notice it looks a bit odd up there at the moment. You'll notice this is now affecting the other as well. It is a permanent replica and it doesn't really matter which one you select. They will each replicate each other. For those top two, I'm actually okay with that. Just put them more centrally on the heater. But I actually want one that's slightly different between that. So I've done Shift D this time and we'll lift that up a bit. So I'm going to go back into edit mode, and we often seem to have a sort of box in the center of these sort of valves as they're called. So I'm going to select that loop and just extend it out a little bit. It doesn't really need to have any real thickness to it, so I'm just going to now press E, so G and then Z. I'll extend that up a fair way like that, and then we'll take another of these and just put it on the top. What you will need to do with each of those is add some thickness to them. So before we do that, I'm just going to do Control J and just join them all together. They'll no longer duplicate each other when you make changes because they're all one object now, but they've still got the subdivision surface on them. And you notice that we've got a slight odd effect there at the top. So I'm going to press Control R to add another loop and just bring that up to the top there, and that will just fix that bit. We don't have a problem down the bottom one. So go back to modifiers and we'll add a solidify modifier this time. And you notice everything suddenly got a little bit of thickness. So if we go into preview mode, it's starting to shape up now. So we need to give this some different materials. So this central block tends to be a sort of some kind of dark grey material, obviously a metal. So we'll go to materials down here and we'll say new, and we'll call this dark metal, and we'll set this to a sort of mid-grey colour, maybe the slight blue cast to it. And we need to indicate what part of the material is going to be this colour. In edit mode, make sure that we've got our shield here selected. And what I did there was hold Alt button down and clicked on one of the vertical edges, and that just selected round on the shield. So we haven't got anything else selected. At this point, I'm going to give this a viewport colour as well. So under viewport display, I'm going to give this a sort of darker grey. So you can see it's all gone that colour at the moment. And that's okay. If we'd coloured this before we joined it together, we wouldn't have that effect, but it doesn't matter. So I'm now going to go up here. We'll give this a slight metallic look to it. We'll take it up to, in fact, we'll make it fairly metallic so it'll have a bit of reflection to it, but we'll leave the roughness high. In fact, we'll take it even slightly higher. It's very dull metal. So I'll add a new one and we'll call this mica. Go back into edit mode, and this time we'll say select invert. So that's everything that wasn't selected is selected and everything that was is no longer selected, and we'll assign the mica texture to that. You can see we've got a slight problem there, but we'll sort that out in a moment. So I put a somewhat more complicated shader on for the mica. You don't see it very well, but nevertheless it needed a little bit more. So to begin with, we'll have a base color which is just slightly yellow, but this time we'll put a subsurface color. So this is a colour that's visible when light passes into something and bounces back out. It's not translucent colour, and arguably these mica sheets perhaps should be slightly translucent. I didn't do that, but it is an effect of light bouncing around inside an object and coming back out again. You'd see it if there was a light behind someone's earlobe perhaps, or through the edges of their nose. These are often places where you see the effects of a subsurface colour. So I gave this quite a bit of yellow, and then I set subsurface up to 1. This is the amount of the effect that you get. I put metallic up at about 0.6, but I made it fairly shiny, so I turned roughness down to a low value of about 0.1, maybe slightly lower than that. Remembering we haven't really got any lights in the scene yet, so I'm going to put a light in now. Come out of edit mode and add, let's just put some 3-point lights in. That's a nice and easy thing to do, but we do need to move them around a little bit. So 3-point lighting is a very basic lighting setup that generally gives you what you need for most things. You have a bright light that's a very small source, you have a less bright light that is more diffuse and just fills in the shadows, and then you have a sort of mid-bright light that's a little bigger than the rim light, the light that illuminates just the edges of things, but it's the main illumination for the scene. Because my scene's actually quite large, I'm going to probably need to turn the power of these lights up quite a bit. I decided to shrink the scene down a little bit, and that makes it a little easier with the lamps. So we're beginning to be able to see what's going on now. Let's turn the floor grid off. I also set alpha down slightly on my material, but to make use of that, you'll also need to set blend mode and potentially shadow mode to alpha hashed or blend, something like that. I'm going to turn screen space refraction on and subsurface translucence on as well. So that's the beginning of the material, but it's got a little way to go yet. You can see it's quite shiny. So in order to get sort of slight variations in the material, I added a copy. So Shift D and copied that principled shader. This time I set a different subsurface colour, a much lighter colour, and at a lower level, and a slightly yellower surface colour or base colour, slightly higher metallic setting, and I added some anisotropic. So this is where you get a sort of brushed metal effect and turn roughness up slightly. So this, if you like, if you were polishing something in a particular direction, then it would give you scratches that are too small to see but would effectively extend light. Any reflections would be extended in a particular direction. So anisotropy is basically saying that the reflections are directional to a certain extent. And that's why you've got an anisotropic rotation as well, because that's effectively saying it was polished in a different direction. You get it with anything that's got very fine lines on its surface, like a record or even a CD, where you, although it gives you a diffraction pattern, there is a certain anisotropy to it as well, because they go in a particular direction. And for that one, I set the alpha down a little lower. So now we need to bring both of those into bear. So I'm going to add a shader, which is a mix shader, and they go into either side. So on the one side, it looks like that. On the other, it looks like that. So slightly different, but not hugely so. Now I'm going to add a texture, which is Voronoi texture. So this is just a generated pattern. You notice I haven't bothered unwrapping anything, and it's not really necessary so far. I set it to 4D. Essentially all 4D does is just give you an extra dimension of variation. I left the scale at default. I set it to distance to edge. W I left at default. Scale I set to 15. We may need to tweak that again, and randomness the default of 1. Duplicate that, so we've got another Voronoi texture, but this time I set the W to 0.6 and the scale to 2.5. So the same kind of pattern, but at different scales and a different point in their pattern. Now I'm going to add a converter, which is a math node, and put both of those into there, and it's set to add. I'm now going to add color mix node, put both of those patterns into there, and set it to add, and the factor up at 1. So they're both being mixed together. Now add a converter, which is a color ramp. Take the output from the mix node into there, and then use that as the factor to switch between one principled shader and the other. I left the color ramp on linear, but then draw these points in. Basically it's increasing the contrast, and you can now see sort of pattern starting to appear in the surface. My thinking was it's sort of a little bit crystalline, but there's many different ways to do this. And then of course you can tweak the scale. So if we tried 10 for example, you can see that's slightly different. 2 got a bit more again. So just to add some sort of interest, and you can play around with that to see how that works for you. This particular one, I think that looks a bit more interesting. And then finally, just to give it a bit more surface texture, I added another texture, which was a noise texture. Take the factor of that and connect it into displacement, but then add under converter a math node, drop that in there, set it to multiply, and I set the value to very low, to 0.001. So it's basically just adding a little random ripple to the surface. And then the scale I set to about 35, and distortion I set to about 3. Probably more transparent than it needs to be at the moment. So you can play around with that, but that's basically the idea. I also modeled little tiny wires using the same way that I made the heater wire. So just basically a little curve path, and then add a bevel to it, because you can get the little shapes that you want. And I also put a little ring of cylinders at the bottom to be the wires. If you want to be anywhere near accurate, you need a few more widgets in here just to represent electrodes and things like that. So notice there's a little bit of an issue here with the material. So if we add another loop, we can then just drag that up like that, and that fixes that issue sufficiently at least. And then we need to move on to our enclosure, so the glass encapsulation. So I'm going to add a mesh circle, and we'll put that about the center of the object, and just needs a little bit of a gap. As I said, with the one that I made before, I did have a load of little pins. I'm not going to worry about those again, they're just cylinders. Go into edit mode on our circle, E, click GZ, and just drag that up like that. Then E again, GZ, and we'll take that in, E, GZ, and then F just to fill the end. So we need to control R and put some more edge loops here. I'm just going to try to get the sort of shape that I want here first. Just an approximation of it, because we're going to add a subdivision surface. And then if we select this bottom ring, E, G, Z, and then in slightly, E, scale in, then GZ down slightly, and press F there to close it off. Now we'll add a subdivision surface with Control 2, so you can see that's added it. If you want to add it manually, just go up to add and say subdivision surface. By default it'll be 1, I want a level 2 one. So you can see that's not bad. Go to wireframe, perhaps we want to pull that out slightly. We're just trying to get the shape that we want. Now I will add some more loops, really because I want these edges to be quite straight. I think that's what they should be like, rather than slightly bowed in the middle. And I'm going to add a few more anyway, and that's because we're going to do something with the decal later, and we need geometry for that. So it's going to get a slightly complicated node setup once we've got the decal on there, but it shouldn't be too bad to start with. So we'll add a new material. We'll call this silvered glass. Before we go any further, because we're going to want to see how this looks, I'm also going to add a solidify modifier just to give it some thickness, because of course we can see through this, so we need to be able to see what it looks like. If you do Control A and apply the scale, that's a good idea as well. So we just need to look on the edge somewhere, and then as I adjust this, you can see we can either push it out or pull it in. We'll pull it in. Okay, so going into rendered view, we'll right click it and say shade smooth, back to materials, and if we come down here, I'm going to set alpha down at 0.1 for this one, but we're going to need to set the blend. We're going to need to set the blend mode to something other than opaque. So I'll select alpha hashed, and you can see it's immediately started to become see-through. And shadow mode, I used alpha clip. It's just different ways of calculating transparency. So we can somewhat see through now, although the surface is obviously not shiny yet. I'm going to set the roughness to 0.01. And I used an index of refraction of about 1.55. 1.45 is about right for normal glass, but I wanted a slightly higher value. Make sure the surface color is full white, and then I set it all the way over to metallic. And what I want is to turn this upper part silvery. Essentially it's a metallization on the inside of the glass, presumably keep light out for that particular area. It can affect some things. So I'm going to duplicate the existing principled shader, so zoom in on that a little bit. Then I'm going to add a shader which is a mix shader. Drop that there and put the other principled shader into the other side. So at the moment it doesn't do anything because they're both the same. I'm going to make both the glass, I think, and particularly this second principled shader slightly yellow, but I'm going to turn the roughness of this second principled shader up to about 0.2. And you can see that's now made it very silvery. If I go all the way over to that side, we've got a certain amount of silveriness there. And then I'm going to take the alpha all the way up here. So now we've got essentially a silvery material. We can play around with the roughness. Obviously you could have it completely mirrored, which might be accurate, but certainly in a scene where it's very dark, that makes it very difficult to see because the lights will just be pinpoints. So have the roughness up at about 0.1, 0.2, somewhere around there. But now what we want is to fade between the transparent glass and our silvery material. So we need to do something with this mix shader because it's clear here and silvery there. So first of all, I'm going to add a converter, which is my usual color ramp, and we'll plug the output of that into the control on the mix shader. I'm going to add in a converter, which is a math node, leave that as add, and the reason for this will become clear later, and we'll connect that into there. I'm going to add a converter, which is a separate XYZ node, and I'm just going to take the Z output. Now, my object is oriented vertically. If yours was oriented horizontally, you might want to use X or Y depending on which way around it was, but generally speaking these devices are used in the vertical orientation. So I connected the Z out there, and then finally I'm going to add an input, which is a geometry node, and take the position out of there and put that into there. So essentially the position of any particular voxel or point is made up of an X position, a Y position, and a Z or Z position, and we're just interested in the Z position. I've just pulled these in a little bit, but the important thing at the moment is this add node here. So I can't tell you the exact value. I can show you the value I'm using here, but it will depend on the physical position of this valve. So you can see as I scroll that to the left, so we can see our silvery metal is going up like that. So I'm going to take it down to somewhere about there. I think typically only the very top of the valve is silvered. Perhaps it's a heat thing, reflecting heat back in. But at the moment we've got a very hard line. So I'm going to change that to B-spline, and then we can adjust these points here so that we get a more blurred line. So it sort of fades in, and you can even see it better here. And as I say, you can adjust the exact height of it there. So maybe somewhere about there. So that's the silvering on the top. And then the final element is just to put the little decal on there. And that's done with this same group of shaders. Before I go any further, I'm going to make sure that I've unwrapped at least part of this valve. I can go one more than that. And I'm going to go round to the back somewhere before I go any further, in fact, and just select that line of vertices, Control E, and just say mark seam. So it doesn't change anything other than making the UV unwrapper know that that is a seam that can unwrap the object with. So I'm now going to press U and just say unwrap. At this point I'm going to say open, and I'm going to open this texture here. So what I did was I took an image of a valve, I actually added the text below it, and I created an image in Photoshop that was essentially white with a clear or transparent background. So there it is, but I suspect it's the wrong way around at the moment. And we'll come back to our shader editor, and you can see we've still got that there. I'll just leave that over there. So I'm going to add a texture which is an image texture, and I'm going to use that Mullard label that I created, or decal. I'm going to add a shader which is a diffuse shader, and the output of that texture I'm going to plug straight into there. Remembering this has got an alpha channel, so this is essentially a mask. So I'm going to take that diffuse output and put it on the bottom here. I'm now going to take the alpha and control the mix shader with that. And we can now see our decal is coming through. It's not right yet, but it's there. I added some roughness to it as well because I thought the ink or paint of the label or the decal probably wouldn't be quite as shiny as the glass. So we now go over to our UV editor, go into edit mode. We can see that our shape is both the wrong way around and way too big. So let's rotate 90 degrees and then scale up. Now you can see we've got another problem happening, and we've gone the wrong way. So I'm going to rotate 180 now. But you can see the label's repeating at the moment. So if we quickly go back to the shader editor, and what we need to do is to actually have two materials for this object. So I'm going to create a duplicate of this material, silver glass material. And before we do anything else, come out of edit mode and just click that little 2. And I'm going to rename that new material silver decal. Go back to the original material, and I'll just delete all of this stuff. We don't need it. And back to the decal version, and you can see everything's looking fine at the moment, but our decal is missing. So go back into edit mode, unselect everything, and we'll now just select a proportion of our object, and with the silver decal version of the material selected, we'll assign that. So you can see our decals appearing there now. So coming out of edit mode, we'll go back to the UV editor. We need to be back in edit mode again actually, and we can move that area around and rescale it to something like that. So now you can see we've got our decal on there. Essentially it's the same material, so there's no effect on the silvering or anything like that. And if we go into our preview mode, you can see there it is, bringing a light round. That lets us see things a little better. So you can see there is our decal. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, let me know. Don't forget to click like and subscribe. I will be uploading the source files for my patrons in Patreon, and hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.